welcome to this side session. That's going to be on climate justice, debt justice, and reparations, reimagining global finance for Africa's future. It's organized by the Pan-African Lawyers Union and the Center for Economic and Social Rights. As we've been talking the entire week, it's very important to try and bring these different buckets of work and buckets of topics together in one way that can provide a unified and combined voice from different sectors of experience, expertise, but also in a way that that came out very much for those who were strong enough to survive until 7:30 yesterday. That came out very strongly in a united African voice. I think this was something that was very clear in the submission that was given by the African Union Commission, the African Young Parliamentarians Network, as well as the African Parliamentary Network on Illicit Financial Flows and Tax, that at this moment in time, we need to find very creative ways and innovative ways to look inwards and make sure there is some sort of harmony, coherence, and coordination amongst ourselves as a continent, as a people, in how we do that. And this topic around climate justice, debt justice, and reparations fits very well into the conversation we've been having this week. More importantly, perhaps for those who are interested and get excited by decoding and deciphering what justice means and who are the custodians of the definitions, perhaps this is also an opportunity for us to interrogate that during this session. What do we mean by debt justice? What do we mean by climate justice in that sense? And then where does the reparations conversation fit in? We heard during the OPA lecture on Tuesday that there is a place, and a very prominent place, for the question of bringing in climate-related dimensions to reparations. We heard that in the keynote yesterday that was delivered in the morning. So a very exciting session, and that's been put together by PALU and CESR. And also a very, very exciting set of panelists and discussions that we have. So we have Ms. June Cynthia Okello, who is the Program Officer, Project Lead for Climate Justice from the Pan-African Lawyers Union. We have Ms. Penina Mbabazi, who's the Climate Justice Lead at the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And then we have Ms. Ruth Ogbe-Wekon, Focal Point and Research and Publication Project Leads Reparative Justice from PALU. And of course myself as the moderator, Jason Braganza from Afrodad. So without much ado, welcome to this session. Welcome to our awesome panelists. And I'm going to start with June. I think it would be very nice for you to just give us the framing from, on what we mean, why we're bringing these three dimensions together. And I know you're going to talk about it from the perspective of harm and repair. So maybe your 10 minutes just to give us a flavor of what we mean by linking harm and repair across, climate justice, debt justice, and reparations.
Thank you, Jason. Morning, everyone. I just want to check my watch to make sure. All right. So I was tasked with linking harm and repair and providing just the historical basis of where we're coming from when it comes to climate justice, because I'll just take the first 10 minutes to lay the basis, and then my colleague Penina will take over from there with debt justice, and then Ruth will just continue with the reparations part of it. So I'll just start with something concerning that I read this morning about Mozambique, where there's a coastal village which was once a home to over 3,000 people, has vanished beneath the waves of the Indian Ocean. And cyclones and rising seas have swallowed not only homes, but also ancestral graves of the people who own that land. And then, yet the people most affected have contributed least to the problem, have received almost nothing to rebuild their lives. So it just, those kinds of things that you read every day about the problems that you're facing when it comes to climate reminds you why you're actually doing the work that you're doing. So historical climate harm, as we all know, and as the speakers from the plenary sessions have mentioned over and over, stems from the first and the second industrial revolution, right, which began in the 18th century and into the early years of the 20th century because of the use of fossil fuels. And the first assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which was published in 1990, is the one that first confirmed that human activities, especially greenhouse gas emissions, were influencing global climate, right? So from there, then, we have the problem, climate change. And to deal with the problem, 3 measures have been put in place. There's mitigation, and then there's adaptation, and then there's reparation, right? So mitigation, which deals with reducing emissions. How do we reduce emissions? What should we put in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And secondly, adaptation, which is just putting in place the systems we adjust the systems that we're currently living in to be able to deal with the climate problem. And now there's reparation, dealing with irreversible harm, things that we cannot, actually, you cannot change the situation how it is. For example, loss of lives, sinking islands, salinization of farmlands, those kinds of things. They can literally not be reversed. So that's where we're coming in with reparations, right? Because adaptation and mitigation right now is just out the window. So when you look at the evolution of UN climate negotiations, or what we call legal climate obligations, from 1992, during the Rio Earth Summit, where the UNFCCC, the UN framework, yes, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. And climate change was framed as a global responsibility, but language on compensation was avoided. Take note of that. And then in 2007 at COP13, loss and damage were recognized more explicitly, linking climate change impacts to human suffering in the global south. And then we moved to COP15 at Copenhagen in 2009, where there was a call for developed countries to provide 100 billion annually by 2020. We're now in 2025. We've not seen that money. We've seen very, very little of it. But that one specifically was for adaptation and mitigation, not really for the loss and damage. And then we moved to 2013 in Warsaw, where the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage was the first official mechanism to address loss and damage, although without concrete funding mechanisms, right? And then in 2015, the Paris Agreement recognized loss and damage as a distinct issue. But once again, liability and compensation was deliberately excluded due to pressure from wealthy nations. Now this is a pattern, we can see that. And then in 2022, at COP27 in Egypt, there was at least a breakthrough. Parties agreed to establish a loss and damage fund to support vulnerable countries facing irreversible harm. Now, COP28, the fund was operationalized with initial pledges, although far below the scale that we need. Africa right now, according to an ActionAid analysis of 2025, is owed 36 trillion in climate debt, which is not forthcoming. So by 2030, we're supposed to get at least 36 trillion for us to be able to implement our nationally determined contributions. So we'll see how this goes. Now, legally, those are the some of the legal obligations that have come out of negotiations at the Conference of Parties. Now, looking at court jurisprudence, and now what have the court said when it comes to loss and damage? What has the court said when it comes to the compensation that we deserve as a legal obligation, right? So litigation it's not the whole solution, but it could be part of the solution. So the advisory opinions that have been issued, for example, from 2024 up to now, that's the International Tribunal on Law of the Sea, which was issued in 2024 and requested by the small island state, was more focused on marine pollution, not really on compensation. And then the Inter-American System this year issued its advisory opinion to interpret climate obligations under the American Convention, and it affirmed state duties on mitigation adaptation and also addressed loss and damage, and within a human rights framework. Now, ICJ in July this year, at least in my opinion, I believe it's not binding, of course, the advisory opinions are not binding, but my opinion reading the judgment is that it made some pretty binding pronunciations in regards to interpreting the already established legal frameworks. And so some of the pronunciations that the court made are directly addressed reparations and liability and enforced state responsibility when it comes to transboundary harm and duties of cooperation. Now, I want to finish quickly because Jason is looking at me. So from there, I would like to pose a question to the room about, is there anyone familiar with the African advisory opinion process on climate change at all, apart from Dawn? Because people are pointing at Dawn. So we did actually file a request for an advisory opinion. I'll go very quickly. We filed a request for an advisory opinion at the African Court on Human and People's Rights, because following the trend, we know if we do not do this, then just like the pattern has been going on, things will be happening outside of Africa without Africa actually taking a stand on some of these issues, right? And so we decided as Africans to file a request for an advisory opinion on behalf of Africans for the African people and by Africans. So that's ours and specific to our issues. There are issues we've raised in that advisory opinion that would be more specific to Africa and not really applying to others. And one of the main asks is the state's obligations when it comes to loss and damage. How do we repair harm? So we will expect the court to talk more about how we should be, how the states should actually be pushing for climate finance and how this climate finance will be used in reparations on behalf of the African continent. So just as I finalize on this, try to link the historical basis for the need for repair in the harm that has already been caused on the African continent. And so this is just a reminder that climate change is truly and deeply unequal because Africa contributes the least, less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and we're the ones who bear the brunt of it. So even as we look forward to the finalization of the advisory opinion, we look forward to the court pronouncing the need for climate finance as a legal obligation and not charity. And the ICJ is one to draw from, and we're really excited for that because a lot of litigation will come from that will try to make sure that accountability is actually finally realized when it comes to climate finance. So for now, I'll just leave it there and look forward to more discussion. Thank you, Jason.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you very much, June Cynthia. And I think you've already said many things. I wish I was not the moderator now, and I'll start over there because my hand would have then gone up because there's so many questions. Or I might just use my discretion as the moderator to take over also the questions. But more importantly, I think as we go through Penina and Ruth, the question you have asked about who knows about the process of getting an African advisory is so important because it's the same question that Honorable Kanisile asked us, again, for those who stayed with us till 7:30, how many people understand our parliamentary systems, our parliamentary processes and our parliamentary structures. We are here making a lot of noise, but do we know where to channel that noise? Or do we get frustrated because we think our noise is not being heard? So I thank you very much. If there's nothing else anyone else takes from what you said, please let us learn about our systems, our processes, our structures. And with that, Penina, June Cynthia said something about making climate finance a legal statutory requirement. And in all of that, of course, the word finance has been bandied around for centuries and has different connotations depending on with whom you speak with. And perhaps you could enlighten us a little bit on what do we mean by climate finance? What are the landmines that in this conversation we need to be careful of, even as we ask for this legal requirement? Can we be more refined in what we mean by climate finance? Because a lot of the solutions are debt-oriented. A lot of them mortgage resources, mortgage our future. So maybe you could give us an insight, from your perspective, how we look at this idea of climate finance.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, June, for setting the discussion. Yes, climate finance, of course, has been shared as a broad term, and there have been discussions on what we need to actually now look at what climate finance means, specifically when it comes to the resources, but also in regards to what is being put out from the UNFCCC, but ideally from the whole climate finance system, looking at a number of debt-based solutions that are kind of actually trying to blindside us and promote that for Africa's climate emergency, that they could center on debt swaps, where countries can negotiate for debt restructuring with creditors, but in the exchange of funding climate and nature-based projects, and along with mechanisms for debt relief during climate disasters and the promotion of green and local currency bonds to finance the climate action and industrialization. So you find that there's a lot of push, and we felt the push in regards to how so many of these initiatives are kind of coming in as a solution, and yet we actually know that they are really market-based and market-driven, more in encouraging a capitalistic nature, to see that we are kind of trying to see how can you find ways of instead trying to have a comprehensive framework for debt relief that instead puts a lot of the developing countries at risk because they're still highly indebted, and yet from the resources, the mere resources that they have, even just collecting taxes, you already know that the high interest rates that keep capping most of the revenue is still not going to fight the climate crisis. So those debt-based solutions that have been fostered have still continued to shift really the blame on developing countries. And some of it has also been shown that even for the portion of the country's debt, you still find even social services is still not a priority. And that's why for countries like Malawi, and in the previous side session, we're discussing on how literally there's no percentage of a budget that can go more than 50% to social services. You find that between 12% from health, 11%, some even as low as 8%, because priority has still been taken away. But for a lot of the debt solutions, climate-based solutions, is that we are still seeing that they still undermine national sovereignty, and there are also a lot of arguments on how these swaps are actually patchy. They are really slow and complex, but also expensive in regards to what we are losing. So land can never be, recovered once we go into the discussions of carbon trading, carbon marketing, carbon markets as well. But also when it comes to livelihoods of those people, is that they get to actually be removed from those pieces of land. And you cannot equate what that loss is, even when we try to quantify it. So when we look at climate finance, is that how best can you actually quantify that these debt solutions, debt climate solutions are actually going to breed any financing that could support developing countries going forward. So you find that still they are highly capitalistic, extractive, and all in all, they are not really solutions, but instead deepen in the inequalities, and there's no remedy on ground, no remedy to see that communities can be protected in case their livelihoods are actually lost. And of course, the shift of looking at current funding for mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage, it still also falls short in what is actually needed to match the scale of the climate crisis, to uphold human rights and deliver justice. And still, an emphasis is also made on how much was actually lost in regards to when we actually look at the fossil fuel, fossil subsidies. Annually, there's over 7 trillion that has been calculated that is showing that corporations, I don't know if there's an echo. Okay. Okay, so there's still emphasis that shows that, okay, just a second. Okay. Okay. Yes, still saying that fossil fuel subsidies, over $7 trillion is spent annually towards fossil fuel subsidies. And you find that huge corporations are still profiting. So even we look at the discussion around mitigation and adaptation, it's no wonder that a lot of emphasis is put towards mitigation. And you get to see that even in regards to strengthening public goods like infrastructure, healthcare, social security systems, and education, many projects that are most indispensable for adapting societies to grow in climatic threats, whether it's construction or more resilient water distribution networks, there's still a much bigger loss that will be acquired from a from the private finance perspective, because they are more of looking at profits, and heavily it's that you find that even the ratio right now, looking at between the investment of mitigation versus adaptation, it's 300 to 1. And this is challenging in regards to adapting to a rapidly warming and transforming world, but also looking at the issues to do with how best we can actually utilize either funding when it comes to a loss and damage fund, that even now it's still not a priority because we find that resources are not actually there, how they're going to be accessed, how they're going to be utilized, all that is not in our power. So we're practically just looking at finding ways to manage and to see how to manage the climate crisis at a national level. And you find most governments are still constrained because they still need social services, they still need to see that they're able to have budgets enough that can actually cover for this crisis. So even aside that, looking at it from a reparative framework, is that along the injustice, along the challenges that we see in trying to find that legally there should be provisions that support, that can encourage human rights at the center, to have that even for these debt-based solutions, we can actually push against them. But instead, we're finding more and more they're coming out as a solution. And that's why even for COP29, climate finance was actually a loss for all of us, because we did not get what we actually wanted. And we instead got more of an emphasis of the multilateral institutions coming in to support, so that they're supporting climate crisis funding and all. But even the private sector coming in is also crucial, and yet also a challenge, because we cannot hold them accountable. And we also still need to see that we're able to ensure that we have equity as well as access for developing countries to actually address the climate crisis issue. Yeah.
Great. Great. Thank you very much, Penina, for that, and for bringing to the room this idea of how complex the climate finance conversation is, and the different dimensions that we need to consider. And I like, interestingly, how you've concluded. The conversations are moving towards this issue of private finance, or increasingly bringing into the room the private sector. And you've said, on the one hand, perhaps there's a perception or a feeling by government and decision makers that you can't exclude the private sector from this conversation because they're the ones who have the deep pockets. But on the other hand, then what is the accountability framework that needs to be put in place to ensure that we can hold private sector account, if that is indeed one of the options that we may want to consider or think about or interrogate even further. And I say that deliberately about interrogating it even further because, Ruth, in your submission, you're going to be talking about reparations and how do we integrate reparations into this. To a very large extent, the historical damage. June Cynthia started her submission with 2 industrial revolutions. Some might argue that it goes beyond that in the context of our conference this year. These were the roles of, or the agents were private agents that were facilitated by kingdoms or monarchs to conduct very damaging ecological and climate-related activities on the continent. And so how do we frame that conversation when our governments, our politicians, policymakers still feel it is important for private sector to be part of it? Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Jason. Yeah, it is still morning. Morning, everyone. Ruth here from the Pan-African Lawyers Union. I think I have some slides that should be projected, but as that carries on, or as they try to sort that out, I just wanted to say that June and Penina have done, June talked about the historical background, Penina talked about the debt and how that, intersects with climate justice. And really what I want to do, and I don't want to take too much time, is to anchor this conversation within reparations. And I think first I'll just start by giving a broad overview of, this is fine. A broad overview of what we mean by reparative justice, or what we mean by reparations. I'm not going to read everything, but I have color-coded the important terms that we need to note for this conversation. And that is redress, which is what we mean say reparations. So in law, reparations is codified as the right to redress or the right to compensation. And then violations, and as you read violations, think perpetrator, because we can have a violation without a violator. And so that's perpetrator. And then victims, because we need to be able to identify communities, individuals, who are the people that suffered the 4th element, which is the harm. And so when you have these 4 together, you can articulate reparative justice and you can articulate reparations. And so this is the OHCHR's, thank you. This is the OHCHR's definition, right? But if you look at state practice, you look at the codification of the right to redress, international law, African, AU law, as well as national law, these are the most common elements. So the perpetrator, the victim, and the harm equals to redress. And so that's just reparations generally, right? And now when we zone in on climate reparations in particular, considering this and considering what has been said, there is a double jeopardy here. So there is the historical harm with violent extraction that happened on the continent, deforestation, cutting down our trees and our forests to build railroads, expulsion of indigenous communities from their land, erasure of indigenous environmental protection systems, on the other. And then at the same time, the Industrial Revolution that was happening contributed to a lot of environmental degradation, which is the effect of which is what we're seeing today with biodiversity loss, with global warming, famine, etc. The swelling of the river, loss of land, and what she was talking about with Mozambique of an entire community losing their land. So that's the historical stuff that happened with environmental injustice and the legacy of that, right? And then we have another level, which is what Penina was talking about, is the fact that the solutions that were proposed for this environmental injustice is in and of itself an injustice because it contributes to our cycle of debt. And so if you think about it this way, it's a situation of we're all in this room, someone comes in, they hold us hostage, they take all our clothes. And then because they've taken all our clothes and the AC is on, we start getting sick. Some of us have pneumonia. And then these same folk come back and say, well, we will give you medication, but the medication has to be salt water. So you don't even have a choice as to what medication you will take. It has to be salt water. And then they say, you have to pay us for this medication we're going to give to you. There is something inherently wrong with that layout. And so when you start to think about reparations and climate and debt, with this in mind, you start to see why it's a double jeopardy. So we were harmed first with the historical injustices and their legacies, and then we are harmed again with the solutions that were proposed with climate finance being articulated as debt. And so yeah, it's phase one and it's phase two. And I don't know if that's working. Right. So in articulating this, and I thought maybe it would be helpful to visualize what I'm talking about. And yesterday I was thinking a lot about this topic, and I was telling June this morning that I'm on the precipice of something, a mathematical formula. But I don't know maths. I barely passed it in high school. And so I talked to June and I was like, June, do you know maths? Does this make sense? And so when we think about reparations generally, we have this, right? You have the victim, and then you have the harm. That has to be there, divided by the perpetrator, because the perpetrator is present in victimizing people, and they are also present in putting forward the harm. And then when you have this formula together, then you have redress. You can ask for redress, or you can articulate redress. But then when you move to climate reparations, and I don't know if that's come through yet. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, it gets a bit more complicated. And this is where my knowledge of basic math failed me. And thank you, June. And so you have the environmental harm that happened during colonialism, during apartheid, during slavery, and the direct degradation of the environment on this continent as the environmental harm. And then you have the solution, which is debt, as a second harm, so the double jeopardy, equaling to harm square. Right? So 2 levels of harm. Now we have harm square, and then we bring that into the equation and we say we have 2 levels of harm when we talk about environmental injustice in Africa. And then that harm is divided by the perpetrator, because guess what? Perpetrator is not just one. So we have the former colonial powers, but then as Penina was saying, we have state actors and non-state actors, and we have individuals as well. Belgium, Leopold, and his descendants. So yeah, you have that. And so you need to be able to articulate perpetrator in multiple from that. That's why you have to divide it with the perpetrator, multiplied by the victims. Because again, it's not just one. So you have collective victimhood that people from the global south have, and then you have collective victimhood of African people, and then you have collective victimhood of specific communities. Then you have individual victimization. Right, your direct ancestor was kicked out of their land, and the land was destroyed, and then you have et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so multiplied by the victims equals to redress. And that makes sense, and it's not just something that makes sense in June and I's head only. And so, yeah, I thought it was helpful to visualize that. And so now, moving forward, right, with this in mind, what are some of the things that we can consider for solution building? So the first one, of course, would be framing. And I think Penina was talking a little bit about how we articulate this issue. And I think, as well as the plenary, I think yesterday, I forget exactly who, someone made a query and said, how do we even calculate the extent of this, right? And I think framing is very important. So here in this room, for the instance of us who are hostages, we naturally might begin to frame our issue as the fact that we are all sick, or the fact that they are making us drink salt water, or the fact that the salt water is too expensive. But we forget the first layer, which is the historical, the fact that our clothes were taken away. And so we must not lose sight of the first jeopardy and only focus on the current jeopardy, which is debt, which is environmental degradation, climate crisis, etc. So we must therefore frame debt justice and frame climate justice in a way that is equitable, that is centered on rights-based approaches, and also understand that when we talk about climate justice, it is restitution. On one hand, we're trying to restore the global south, we're trying to restore Africa to the point that we're at, if not for these injustices, right? And then, an endless attempt, because if you really think about it, it's almost impossible to restore us back to where we were, I don't know how many centuries ago, because too much has happened. But we can attempt to do that. And so when we have that framing, then it is easy for us to say, debt as climate finance, it is not reparations, it is not restitution. So what we really should be asking for is something like debt cancellation. It's something like remodifying loans for climate finance as grants or as compensation and re-articulating that in and of itself. And, equity, of course, is recognizing the historical basis of which Africa's current problems are built on. And just lastly, we need innovation, right? I think we can all agree, I have a background in law, and we've agreed that the law has its limitations because it is inherently Eurocentric. And I think that is the same for the global financial architecture as well. And so we need innovation. In law, we have something called the third world approaches to international law. Perhaps now it's time for the third world approaches to debt. It's time for third world approaches to climate justice, et cetera, third world approaches to economics. So we need innovation in this way. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all. Please leave that up. Please leave that one up, because can we go up to that? Because I see Briggs in the room, and he's the one who talked about formulas and starting formulas yesterday in his submission. So Briggs, I think you and Siviwe can have a conversation over wine today and tell her you've got a starting point here. But comrades and friends, the beauty of having also legal minds on this panel, but in the room, is the use of the English language. When I saw that, my first, where it says perpetuator, I thought it was perpetrator. But it's important to know perpetuator. The legal minds are very clever how they play with language here, because you can understand the perpetuator is a continuum. Yeah, it continues, which means it's not just the historical present, but possibly also in the future. So thank you very, very much. So your maths is mathing, as the young people might say these days. I'm trying to, align with or identify with the Gen Zs from Kenya. I saw a lot of the Kenyans yesterday said, I align with the Gen Zs, so I want to do the same. But comrades, we're going to open it up. I think there's some really, really exciting things that have come up. And okay, so we'll start from the back, coming this way. So Comrade Molly, the comrade here, Macmead, Martha, Elvis, and then we'll finish with you, sir. So let me bring you the mic. You guys use that because you're answering questions. So.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jason. And thank you to the panelists for the inputs. I have a comment mixed with a question. I like the formulas, and I'm glad we're already, being mathematical about this whole thing, because we do need to be mathematical so that we can be able to tell people how much they owe us, because they owe us. And I think from yesterday, we've been saying they really owe us. We don't owe them, they owe us, and we need to tell them how much they owe us. So I think these formulas are critical, and I think we must just use the mathematical approach. So it's highly appreciated that you are using it. And I just wanted to say, as we discuss this, I would like us to also add the mineral energy industrial complex, so that we discuss everything within that framework. For example, in South Africa, we've been told to stop producing coal, and yet there's advanced technology now discovered by the Department of Science and Technology about production of clean coal. But it's ignored in the broader discourse of climate change and energy. And yet we have 500 years reserves we have coal that can last 500 years in production of energy. And I mean, recently with the war in Ukraine, or the operation in Ukraine, we have seen, I mean, Germany is no longer able to get gas from Russia, and we have seen lots of coal leaving South Africa to Germany. So the hypocrisy around the whole thing. So I would wish for us to also reframe whether there is an issue, or the issue is because Europe no longer has coal, and everybody must stop producing coal, because and how we put together the issue of justice. And I'll repeat what I said also yesterday, that the hydro energy, we are told that the Inga project in Congo, if it can really work, it can electrify the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. Now we have seen Ethiopia with their Renaissance Dam, and we are very happy that they did it, even without the support of the World Bank that refused to fund Ethiopia, but the Ethiopians themselves funded themselves in that project. So that would be my wish.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Molly, for that. Comrade.
Yeah, thank you very much for the gender insensitive panelist. You made a very good input. There's just a moderator, I'm just a panelist. Yeah, it's on a lighter note. I think that my first question will go to the first speaker. I like your presentation very well, but I pick it up as a tendency from the lawyers. You rely on the issues of legality. But the people that are suffering most are local people who are poor, who does not even afford your legality, meaning that they cannot take whoever to court because they don't have resources. It's not necessary to combine both legality and social dialogue, so that those that cannot afford those processes, at least they have that leeway of dialoguing with a perpetuator. That is one. The second one goes to the last speaker. I like the way you break it down, that it's coming from the family to the community to whoever. Now, I'm coming from Namibia. There is a reparation discussion, I think, that we heard about yesterday. But the argument of the government is that this is a discussion of government to government. That is one issue, meaning that multiplied by victims is left out. It's government to government. And in Africa, we know that the governments are normally formed by majority tribes. And majority tribes in many instances are not the one that the one who haven't suffered much. Like in Namibia, the two tribes, they were reduced almost to zero. Meaning that now if they have to go for election, they are always in minority. But the government is run by majority who have no sensitive issues towards it. They just want to push the matter off the table, and they complete it that way. Where does the victims play a role? And even when we are talking about the issues of reparation, what are we saying? Are we saying that the government are the right institutions to be our mouthpiece? Or how do we play around it so that the real people can speak for themselves? Very last one is the issues of parliament that you raise. I don't know in Namibia, and I'm still sitting with that one. Is parliament really lawmakers? I don't think so. Because what happened is that Parliament debate what come from executive. Executive seat, they won't even have the cabinet committee on legislations and whatsoever. They bring the bill to Parliament. Parliament argue around that bill, it goes. And how do they make it? Or maybe in other countries, if there is any other arrangement, tell us. To us, we have only two ways. One is through the cabinet submission. Another one is a private bill something. And the rules that are set on that are so difficult that even the private citizen cannot bring that bill. It's very difficult. So I don't know how to deal with that, but we can talk.
Thank you very much. So far we have the geopolitics and politicization of decarbonizing, the issues Europe is going through. Are they being, imposing in terms of how they shift narrative? Here it's the bridge between legal, social movements, and then the parliament, minority, majority, who is the executive, how laws are made so far. Yes.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you very much, colleagues and comrades. I really like this formula, and it has triggered a number of questions. And I want to ask, again, like you, Ruth, I'm not also mathematically inclined. So the first question is around the harm. You've raised it to the power of 2, right? But I was just thinking, because there are recent debates with colleagues, some of whom you know, Comrade Mununi Mutoka, who is actually arguing that the environment itself is a victim. So the victimhood that we're talking about is not just human victims or survivors, but the environment itself. How does that then fall under the category of the victims that we're talking about? And then in terms of the loss or the harm or the debt, I see that you've categorized environmental harm plus debt, which has given us the harm raised to the power of 2. But I was just wondering if the formula will allow an addition or inclusion of other harms that have been committed, so that it's not limited to just harm raised to the power 2, especially if we're talking about intersectionality of the harms and crimes that have been committed. Let's take, for instance, the campaign of the Landless People's Movement. In Namibia, we're working with them, that's as the comrade mentioned, in Latin America, and in other parts of the world. Whether it's multinational corporations or states or the perpetrators, as you call them, or I call them the colonial criminals, when they commit these crimes, there are a number of things that are lost. The ecosystem is lost, biodiversity, but the land itself from whence people get their livelihoods is also lost. So how do we ensure that the loss of land, not just the other bits that we get from the land, but the loss of land itself is considered under this formula? And then other elements of our spirituality. Our lands are linked to our ancestral and other spirituality. We also lose our connections with our ancestral and spiritual inclinations. Now, we engage with and you were with us in Addis when we engage with the Ogiek people and some of the things that they reference. How does this formula take into consideration those other losses, not just the physical, but the metaphysical and spiritual? And in terms of the redress, in Nigeria, we worked with the Bodo community and to get Shell to not just pay for the pollution that was caused by their oil spills, but also for other elements. Now, what will constitute redress in the context of climate, criminal activities perpetrated by both the state and non-state actors, including multinational corporations? Will clean up, for instance, of environments that have been polluted constitute part of that redress, and who should do that, those cleanup? Because there's a case right now against Shell. But I'll pause there. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much. I don't know, I did a bit of maths, so maybe I can try and offer something a bit later. So I'll do Martha, Elvis, and we'll come back here.
Yeah, thank you so very much. Molly, my dear sister, coming from Ethiopia, you spoke of the Grand Dam. It is possible to do it. 16 years ago, I was heavily pregnant. I was not working. But from my savings, I worked, because I was living in Nairobi, I worked to the Ethiopian embassy to contribute to the dam. That is financing. We can do it. It is doable when no one wanted to touch that dam. Yeah. No, but I wanted to say something about this loss and damage, and I don't know how familiar we are with the historical background. It was in 1991 with Vanuatu's submission. This concept, that was just before actually the UNFCCC was established. And you'll be surprised that when it started, it was supposed to be a liability and compensation mechanism. And then there were those that were pushing for risk management and insurance. And the loss and damage that we have now is a compromise between those two. But it does not come from a reparations point of view. So how do you now want to reframe that when the boat seems to have sailed? That is number one. Number two, you have the ICJ, which is an opinion, I think. Of course, you are the lawyers. So this framing, I'm not that clear about it. Jason, in the morning, you were saying in the early morning session that we need to be very careful when we are in the climate space so that we do not undermine some progresses that have been made elsewhere. And completely agreeing with you, because this conversation of climate finance, it has to go hand in hand with the debt conversation, even with the investment dispute settlement, for instance, with trade regimes and so on. So if I give you an example, for instance, in 2022, external financing, we found that 57% of assistance to African LDCs for their adaptation was coming in the form of concessional loans. And that gave rise to the movement of grants only. We do not accept any loans. In any case, I can tell you, on the eve of Christmas, 24th December 2020, the government of Kenya had already said that any assistance, financial assistance for their NDC implementation, if it comes as a loan, they do not consider it as external financing, rather their domestic contribution to climate. Same with Gabon. Gabon, on behalf of the African group of negotiators, they said if the financial assistance comes in the form of bonds, in the form of loans, it doesn't talk about concessional or non-concessional. In any case, both have to be paid back. If they come, then this is a revolving revenue that they do not recognize as the climate effort, because you spoke of the 100 billion being made, because they were adding those. So what I'm trying to say is that when we are also having this systemic change and systems change, they have to speak to each other. Let me stop here before you snatch it.
I was not going to snatch it. Just gently standing so that we can move and finish on time. Elvis, and then I come to the gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Elvis. I represent Somali Climate Action Platform based in Mogadishu, Somalia. And when you talk about these issues of climate, debt, and everything, I think Somalia is one of the countries that is heavily impacted by multiple of these kinds of things. And as we may know, Somalia was kept out of the international financial systems for over 30 years due to the instability that existed, and has just recently been incorporated back through the HIPIC, the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, which then gave some debt relief to Somalia, and therefore they are able to at least access some financing again. But again, the thing is here is what can then African countries do? Because there's that possibility of falling back again into the same trap. Because at the moment, Somalia is under reconstruction. And many of this reconstruction work would still require the country to go back and borrow and get this financing through debt again. So what is it that African countries and many others which have similar experiences do to ensure that they don't fall back to the same trap, but still retain the ability to achieve the Agenda 2030 aspirations of the Paris Agreement and also Agenda 2063, because there's that fear that, again, they might fall back into the same trap even after exiting through such initiatives like HIPIC. Thank you.
Thank you. A very good question, because many countries actually have slipped back after HIPIC. So, and then our final question.
Thank you very much for a very good presentation. I have two questions. The first one, how do you think we can navigate issues around compliance and enforcement in the context where we know international law is purposefully and strategically crafted to make it very ambiguous, including those reparations or genocidal laws? We know they are not very clear. As we know, the devil is in the detail, right? And number two, to avoid the situation where we can yell or shout into the vacuum without anyone hearing us. In the end, we get up stuck in the loop, perpetual loop of keeping on holding these conferences, talking to ourselves, hearing ourselves more than the perpetrators and the perpetuators are supposed to hear us. What are the mechanisms or the ways in which we can sit down side by side by these perpetrators and perpetuators so that they can also respond to our queries and discussions as well? Thank you.
Gabriel, if we're late. Okay, let's allow them to respond, because it's quite a big bunch of questions and comments, and then if I start smelling lunch, it might be different. So let's start with June, and then with Ruth, and we'll come back this way.
Okay. Quite a few questions, and I think I try to note them all. And so starting with the mineral energy industrial complex and how that can be integrated into the formula or into the conversation of merging these three frameworks of climate, debt, and reparations together. I think, mineral energy is something that can be properly articulated on the Jeopardy one, the historical stuff that happened. So some of these harm that you articulating happened during apartheid, during colonialism. And so all of that would be double jeopardy, would be jeopardy one, because it's the historical, right? Yes, the legacies are still being felt today, but it's not necessarily incorporated into jeopardy two, which is now the debt and the cycle of debt that is being perpetuated. So that's how I would articulate it. And so, Macmead, your questions touch on the formula, and I didn't know we would have a validation meeting, but I guess this is it, because you've interrogated, victims, you've interrogated the definition of harm, you've interrogated, who could be the perpetuator, and you've interrogated redress. And my very brief response is not to get into an academic conversation, would be that, well, for one, with harm, this formula is based off of state practice and customary international law on what reparations should entail. Now, that framework has its limitations, right? In that it is very Eurocentric and it is very insistent that harm and victimhood must be associated to a human being because it is a human right. Now, does this properly encompass the African experience? My answer is no. And I think the African Union already recognizes it. This is why when we were doing the African Charter, we didn't say the African Charter of Human Rights. We said people's right, because that framework does not recognize collective victimhood. But we do on this continent. And so if we wanted to ascribe human rights to non-human beings like the earth, and the environment, that is entirely something we can do. And we can do a Pan-African academic study on that, and we can get into it. So who says we cannot, right? That's why we have third world approaches to international law as an alternative or an alternate theoretic process to these frameworks that we have. Now, in talking about, I think your other question was in who would we hold responsible? the redress and the perpetrator. And I think really it depends on who you identify as a perpetrator. So who would do this cleanup, who would pay this money, who would do A, B, C, D. It depends on who you identify. If you are able to identify your own government as a perpetrator of this harm, then you hold them accountable. If you're able to identify the former colonial masters as the perpetrator, you hold them accountable. If you're able to identify non-state actors as the perpetrators, those are the people that you hold accountable. Now, how this will play out, and I think that goes directly to the question he's asking, is like, how do you actually get these people to come in and clean up the river or clean up the ocean and pay, or at least pay for this to be done? That's a different conversation entirely. We have an issue of implementation on this continent. But at least if we start from a point where we have pronunciations and we have this properly articulated as to how we want to see it go, then I think that's good enough at this point. We have many years, or not, because the climate crisis is not, it doesn't really give us a lot of time, but I like to think that we have some time to think this through properly. And I think there's another question on, victims, right? And who would be a victim under this formula? And what type of harm can we articulate under this formula? Can we articulate loss of cultural heritage? Can we articulate, loss of land, etc. And I think if we go back to the human rights approach, which is what this is based on, when we talk about harm includes, the full definition, if we go back to the first slide with the OHCHR's very general definition, includes gross violations of human rights. Now, loss of cultural heritage or freedom to practice your cultural heritage, your culture without interruption is a human right. And you can articulate and say, well, ABCD was taken away from me, interrupted my enjoyment of my right, that is a harm. So all of this can be, there is room to integrate loss of land, loss of culture into that. I think there was also, there were a lot of questions. I think there was also another question on involving the people in this process. I think that came from the, how do you properly involve the people in this? And I think that this was something that I was trying to say, but I ran out of time in my initial presentation, is that when you base the intersection and the articulation of these three pillars on equity, then you start asking yourself, what does equity mean? And equity in this sense means public participation and the democratization of climate justice processes, as well as the reparations process. And I'm happy that you're from Namibia and you cited, the genocide against the Herero and the Nama. And we saw this, the foundational need to base reparations on equity with the German government and the Namibian government agreement that was recalled because the people said, absolutely not. You didn't involve us in this process, and so it is invalid. So public participation is definitely something that should be part of this process. And when you say reparations, part of the definition of reparations is involving the people, involving the communities. How do we not, so I think I've responded just very quickly, and how do we not fall into the same trap of debt? The only thing I'll say on this is I think there is room for cross-continental learning here. Our cousins in the diaspora, in the Caribbean, particularly Haiti, are properly articulating this issue of falling back into debt. And that is because while the circumstances of accruing debt might be different between them and us, the thing with Haiti is that post-independence, they had the debt imposed on them, which they paid, right? But then now what that sought for them is that they had nothing to build on, to build their development on. And it trapped them in a circle of debt. And a lot of the scholarship that is coming out from that part of the world is saying, you need to forgive the debt we already paid, so you need to give us back all the money that we paid, one, and two, you need to actually pay us reparation because that was a double harm. You harmed us the first time through slavery, and then you harmed us again by making us pay you for our freedom. So I think maybe that is a type of articulation that we need to borrow from, and I think however the Haitian situation plays out, because I know there's a lot of advocacy, and I think even litigation that's coming out of that process. So however that plays out, I think will be very useful for us to keep following.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I also would, I can just share, of course, when we look at the climate finance discussion, it's not just about money, but it's also about power. And on our side, looking at how we are as Africa, there's a need to see that we're also able to push in regards to trying to call for, a UNFCCC-aligned definition of climate finance that actually excludes commercial loans, and for more robust grant equivalence and accounting framework to ensure transparency, fairness, and credibility. So there's a need to emphasize that. And even just looking at what we could anchor our, say, a just climate finance system, is that it needs to be redistributive, where resources do flow from those most responsible for climate breakdown to those most affected, but it also needs to be reparative. Funding is grounded mostly on historical accountability, and it includes compensation, but also rights-based. And finance is not conditional or donor-driven, but it should uphold international obligations and as well be people-powered, as well also be systematic. So there's a need to see that we can actually change the narrative, but still also enforce that by having a clear definition of what climate finance should be that can actually articulate our issues and compensate us indirectly also to the loss that we have seen. And also for the bit of localizing this discussion to the people in the community, that also we need to have discussions around free, prior, and informed consent. For some of the projects and a lot of projects that are being done on ground, whether it's extractive in nature, there needs to be actually a way that community do participate, and FPIC principles have been known to stand at least some true source of people demanding and saying, no, we do not want this project, we want our rights here, and we need to have a say, to say no. So yeah, I could just share that.
Thank you.
Thanks for the questions and the interactive session. So I'll just start by responding to a question from, I've just received a question from the people who are online. So the question is, what is at stake with the African advisory opinion on climate change when it comes to loss and damage and compensation? So just to respond to this and very quickly is that, so as we're all aware, we've been singing it, Africa is not responsible for the situation you're facing when it comes to climate change, right? And when it comes to now looking at the advisory opinion itself is calling upon states and is going to provide legal obligations on the African states, not the other states out of Africa. Although it will help inform some of their decisions because it might help inspire some of the litigation, right? But when it comes to loss and damage, those who should bear the cost of it or compensate for it are outside the African continent. And so when it comes to that, now the African court will be forced now to make those kinds of pronunciations. We understand Africa is not responsible, but this is what African states should do to make sure that those states that are responsible for loss and damage pay. They have a responsibility to do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, because we will, even as we fight for climate finance, as you get this money, your responsibility is to make sure we don't lose it, for example, through illicit financial flows. We don't lose it to corruption. You use it properly for what it is meant for, reparations, right? They also, their responsibility must be placed on them. They should not be receiving the money and then you decide, okay, let me build myself a mansion. You know, those kinds of things, and it will be strict because we know how it's going, even with the odious debts. We know even when we ask for money for other things, not climate now, other things, we know how our governments behave. Now that's the problem. So we know the causation is not in Africa, it's out of Africa. But when it comes to common and but differentiated responsibilities, all of us have a responsibility to mitigate, adapt, make sure just that we take care of the situation when it comes to the climate crisis. But the causation is not in Africa, it's out of Africa. So when it comes to that, then there are people who have more responsibility, the historical polluters, to ensure that we reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, moving on to the next question. Just very quickly, my sister mentioned, and Ruth, I'm sure, has responded. My sister mentioned hypocrisy. That now, when it comes to Africa discovering, we have this amount of minerals, and now the global north, who have been the historical polluters, right now they're like, please, we need to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. Do not mine coal now. I know now there's that, you have to weigh, now there's the right to development. You're wondering, should we use this to develop ourselves, or we just leave it in the ground and then just to contribute to the reduction or adaptation and mitigation measures? There's that dynamic. It has also appeared in the ECOP, East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline campaign issues, blah, 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 that Uganda discovered oil, and then they're like, no, we have the right to develop. We want to develop ourselves with this oil. And the first people are the people in Europe sitting somewhere, they're like, Uganda should not mine that oil. We have to go for them. They should not mine that oil. So there's that dynamic. The hypocrisy is coming out. They want to reverse that we should pay for what's happening. Even when you look at the issue with the CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, it's like now because we're exporting, it's meant to make us pay for the carbon emissions that take place in our production mechanism, our manufacturing and all that, right? Now, as we export to Europe, now we pay. Now, how is that? That is the hypocrisy I'm talking about. It definitely comes out when it comes to international, these discussions. It always comes out, and it's something we need to deal with. We'll know how to deal with it. So, also, just to respond, sorry. Someone mentioned the tendency to rely on issues of legality, and people who suffer the most are the poor. And combine legality and social dialogue. Now, just like my boss who is sitting here always says, every time we start this discussion about the law, he'll tell you the law is not everything. Even as we get up and go to court, litigation is not everything. It is accompanied by a lot of action, other things, because without advocacy, without, for example, journalists, without other people, we will not be able to achieve what we want to achieve. So we all need each other. We are interdependent, because if we just go to court and get a nice piece of judgment, we can't do much with it if we don't make noise. Now we need those people who make the noise around it. So we need grassroots mobilization. We need other civil society actors. We need to speak, so even as we have done a lot of litigation, and even as we do litigation, we always collaborate with other people who are good at campaigns. We work with journalists, we work with communicators. All those people come into play to reach all those people, to make sure to tell you that this is what the law says and this is what should happen. And I would say there's some success in that. Even when you look at the cases we've done, we've had people, even Maasais, come into our office with just the way they're dressed. You know how Maasais dress, they're indigenous, the way they dress, they just come into the office and they know, they're aware of some of these things. They want us to do so and so because they're aware, because the information has reached them in these ways. So I would say the law is not everything, because you cannot just rely on the law to achieve the things that we want to achieve, even in these climate issues. And then Jason is looking at me again. So I want to finish.
I'm beginning to smell the food. I'm smelling the food.
Oh, he's smelling the food. Okay. And just to respond to my sister, yes, I just keep that part. I know the small island states have a significant part to play when it comes to loss and damage, because they were the first to experience this issue that rising sea levels, disappearing islands and all that. So yes, it's Vanuatu that brought it up before even any IPCC or whatever, they brought it up before anyone else. And they tried to some extent to just establish the mechanism of reparation, but yes, it was diverted now into loss and damage and all this, and just the technicalities of issues. You know, the pushback that we've experienced all the way from the moment the climate change issue was established up to now. We know wealthy nations, they do not want to hear anything about it. You've lost something, I'm so sorry. They just want to look the other way. When it comes to compensation, they really do not want to engage in that conversation, because they know they owe these people, they know they owe an amount in reparation, in climate finance and all that. So how do we frame it back now to loss and damage, and back to the reparations part of it, now just reparations? I would say, because now we've come a long way, so many things have happened over the years, and because I'm a lawyer and I'm biased, I would say that there's so many ways of creating the law, there's so many ways of redefining issues, and the courts really help us in redefining issues. Because even if, for example, the UNFCCC from 1992 has just provided a one-liner, for example, on loss and damage, the court in 2025 can really go deeper into what it means, what a one line could mean in reparations, in how to claim. And if I would encourage everyone to read the ICJ decision, because the ICJ decision has been very progressive compared to other advisory opinions. And some of the things that it has said, even on loss and damage, or even how to claim when it comes to reparations, it has literally outlined those steps to take. So the courts will be, instrumental in redefining some of the issues, or defining deeply the issues that were stated 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So I would say the courts really do play a good role. And right now, climate litigation is going on well. We're making good progress. Even after the ICJ decision, I know right now we're going to see so many cases that are going to draw inspiration from that decision, and we're going to make progress. And in Africa, we're not doing that well when it comes to climate litigation, but I would encourage everyone. And also, even as we work on the advisory opinion on climate change, I'd encourage those people who have expertise in different issues to apply to become amicus curiae and advise the court on different issues, so that even as they conclude the advisory opinion, we have a very impactful advisory opinion for the African people.
Thank you very much. I was smelling the food, but in true legal fashion, you did what I would expect from any lawyer. You said the word pursue litigation, because that's what all lawyers want. You used new language, amicus curiae. I don't know how many people know what that means. That's Latin. That's Latin for friend of the case, I think. Friend of the court. There you go. And then you said advisory opinion of the ICJ. And I don't know how many people here know ICJ. They might think it's a music guy, some DJ. They might think it's the title to some new song that's about to come, or a dance. How many people who know what the ICJ that she is referring to? I hope so. There are only like 6 guys, so maybe you tell them who the ICJ you're referring to.
Oh, I am so sorry. Sometimes we just used to saying some of these things continuously, we forget. Yeah, the ICJ is the International Court of Justice.
Okay.
Yes.
And how many people have heard of the advisory opinion? Okay, so that one now you need to share, so that they can get. So, very quickly, Hilda and then Gabriel, but
Yeah,
very briefly,
extremely
please.
brief. Yeah, just on the formula. I'm so sorry because it wasn't an. Yeah, but for us to have harm squared, at least let's make it a multiplication sign instead of an addition. Then on the debt, you add the word harm to make the variable consistent.
Fantastic. Nice.
It's good to see that you're consolidating the formulas. So my comment, very brief also, is just I love the passion that you're talking on the solutions. Basically, climate finance shouldn't result in more debt for African countries. And we are here discussing and consolidating formulas for that. So my comment is the same passion we are having in proposing solutions, we should also use to fight the false solutions that are coming on. These ones, we see the carbon market things. People are being displaced from their land. And we have also, when we see the structure of finance, we see that most of it is going to mitigation, which is not actually what's the most important for us. So we need to have a discussion about this and also fight all these whole solutions with the same passion that we're having here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, because I have a mic. Yeah, I would have loved if she had unpacked the issue of impunity, because we have also experienced such kind of impunity. Such big countries are also doing deliberately to frustrate other countries. Thank you.
Okay. You don't have to respond to these. These ones you take with you to the lunch table. Dawn, before you.
Thank you. Shortly, I just wanted to add to what you said. The climate, if we are thinking about solutions, let's also look at the finance architecture. Can we look at, because the same people who we are sort of owing as opposed to pay, it's loans, as you said, so we are more indebted. But then who goes to, we have a structured IMF World Bank that actually ensures that you pay that loan. But then that climate debt, who is ensuring that it's being paid to us? So can we have a relook at it? Maybe have a sovereign UN structure that actually also holds everybody responsible to ensure that every loan, whether it's climate, whether it's debt as most African countries are in, it's paid on the same terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's something called the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. It's coming soon. It's already in the process. I can assure you of that. Comrades and friends, thank you very much. I think we'll conclude, and the only way to conclude is if Don gives us his concluding remarks as well, because he has something very important to say around the Malabo Protocol. So Don, and then we'll close.
Okay, and I think this may partly answer your question in terms of how can we create enforcement mechanisms that work for us. So I would ask, how many of you have heard about the African Court on Human and People's Rights? Okay. How many of you have heard about the Malabo Protocol that would give the African Court international criminal jurisdiction? Very few. So we do have, within the African legal system, an African Court on Human and People's Rights, which is our continental court, that if your government signs up to, and unfortunately up till now, only 36 of our 55 countries have signed up to, but if you sign up to, it means that when you do your case on a human rights violation all the way to the highest court in your country, and you still do not feel satisfied, you can bring it to the African court. And now, there's another legal instrument, a protocol, that the AU adopted in 2014 in Malabo, that would give this court not just a human and people's rights jurisdiction, but also a criminal jurisdiction, the way we have the International Criminal Court in The Hague, in Netherlands. And the International Criminal Court can try 3 crimes currently: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And in future, it may also try the crime of aggression. That means when one state invades another state. Now, in the African system, again adopting third world approaches to international law, it was proposed to create a court that would cover 13 crimes. So genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression, but also mercenarism, terrorism, illegal cross-border transfer of hazardous criminals, also corruption, money laundering, and what we call illicit exploitation of natural resources. Now, bearing in mind that even when we're talking of environmental degradation on our continent, a good part of it is related to the extractive industry. Extraction of oil, gas, minerals, including critical minerals, forest products, wildlife products, and so on. So I would just like us to think of reparations for what we've talked about, for harming the climate, in the context of the African court. That we'll have our own court, that among the crimes it has is illicit exploitation of natural resources, but also the corruption that's associated with it, also the money laundering that's associated with it, also the mercenarism that's associated with it. And here we are thinking of private military, security companies, and so on. Also, our court provides for individual criminal responsibility, so try the individuals, the way the Rome Statute does. But in addition, it has corporate criminal liability, which means you can hold the company liable, quite apart from holding its individual directors and owners liable. So, if we have all of this within an African system, then imagine the ability of that court to be innovative, to design reparations that would suit affected individuals, communities, states, and even nations. So I think these all contexts just invokes in us again the need to fight for ratification of this instrument, at least to make sure that within the continent, we are able to hold individuals and companies accountable and design reparations innovatively for our people. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much, Don. And I think that's a very poignant way to conclude this session, because yesterday in the opening remarks by the AfroDad chair of the Board of Trustees, she talked about the opportunity of looking inwards. Dr. Patrick Olomo also talked about fixing things from within or advancing things that are already in process. So I think that's one of the things that we should really take away from this session, is that we do have a lot of institutions, processes that we need to educate ourselves on also and bring us together so that we can move as one United Africa. Just as you go for lunch, there's a brochure that's going to be given to you that looks like this. It's called Decoding Climate Finance, and there's a very fancy QR code over there. I think AfroDad needs to learn how to do these things as well. So please see Penina for them. You're between people and their lunch, but okay.
Just briefly, as CSR, we came up with a new guide on decoding climate finance. And this guide is basically supposed to be used in trying to see how data and human rights can confront injustice in climate finance. And what's inside is basically having 3 steps that we found are useful in regards to interrogating, which is to dig into the systems, structures, and power relations that shape the global finance, global climate finance, and also who they benefit. And also 2, which is to illuminate, and this is to use data, storytelling, and community knowledge to expose the injustices embedded within climate finance decisions. And lastly, to inspire, which is to propose bold alternatives that put human rights, justice, reparations, and inclusive development at the center of climate finance. So we're really glad if you could be able to look through, and we are also very open to having a number of discussions on trying to decode climate finance. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.